Breath of the Wild 2 is currently scheduled for spring 2023, and that gives us plenty of time to draw up a wish list for the biggest sequel in gaming. Now, Breath of the Wild was such a classic, however, there were some things that could be improved upon to make it even better. Well, today I'm going to round up 10 things Nintendo should add to Breath of the Wild 2 to make the game even better than the original. Well, if you're new around here or find this useful, don't forget to hit that subscribe button down below for all the latest Zelda content and turn on notifications by hitting that bell. Well, before we get into today's topic of what I'd love to see Nintendo add to Breath of the Wild 2, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. You know, what do you want to see added to the sequel? What was it about the original Breath of the Wild that you think could be improved? And also, if I missed something today off your wish list, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Without further delay, let's dive into the 10 things I'd love to see Nintendo add to the sequel to Breath of the Wild. Well, first of all, I want to see Zelda as a playable character. You know, we've been playing as Link for about 30 years, and it'd be good to do something a little bit different. So personally, I'd like to have co-op play 2 with both Link and Zelda, but I would definitely settle for simply playing as Zelda herself. Ever since we had the first trailer back in 2019, fans have been speculating that Zelda would be a playable character, based on a new haircut and outfit similar to Link's. You know, both of them are embarking on an adventure of some kind following on from the end of the original Breath of the Wild. Well, next up we got durable weapons. So one of my biggest critiques of the first game was the breakable weapon system. You know, I think this was a good experiment to try, and I'm glad Nintendo did it, but ultimately I don't think it worked for me. So what I did like was trying out a variety of weapons, but I do think there are other incentives Nintendo could put into the game for players to mix things up and use different weapons. For example, like weapon rarities or something else like that. So rather than breakable weapons, I would like to see durable weapons. So I think weapons can and should definitely degrade over time, but I think they should be repaired or cleaned whenever you visit a village or a settlement. There was a similar system in Red Dead Redemption 2, and it's reported that the team working on Breath of the Wild 2 have been playing a lot of Red Dead 2 during development, so it's going to be really interesting to see whether any inspiration from Red Dead 2 comes into the game. Well, next up we got aerial combat. So this is something that I got into recently based on the Nintendo patents, you know, where we can see a variant of aerial combat, specifically with a bow and arrow as Link is falling through the sky, and that could be more prominent in Breath of the Wild 2. So given we're going to be exploring Hyrule and the Sky Islands, so it makes sense to have a bit of action in the space between those two locations. Now, it would also be a fairly unique feature to have battles in the sky when you're skydiving. I can't think of another good example off the top of my head at the moment for something similar, but do let me know down in the comments if you've seen another game where you're skydiving and fighting in the sky. Well, next up we got specific weapon quests. So I'd love to see weapon quests added to the game. This is a specific quest where you pick up a lead in a village, off an NPC or somewhere, and then you go off on a quest and you're rewarded with a specific weapon at the end of it. So not rupees, not a consumable, but a specific weapon. Now, I'm a massive fan of looters and MMOs, and while I don't think all mechanics from these games would work in a Legend of Zelda game, I think weapon quests would be absolutely great fun. Now, having a powerful weapon in the game that either you picked up from a quest or perhaps you even defeat a specific boss for and display it like a trophy. Now, we did see a little bit of this in the original Breath of the Wild with specific armor sets and the Guardian Sword, for example, but I would love for this to go even further with weapon quests. Well, next up we've got flying. So given we're going to be in the sky a lot in the game, I would love to see flying added to Breath of the Wild 2. Now, at the moment, we've seen Link skydiving, and we got clues pointing to aerial battles being added to the game via the Nintendo patents. Now, I'd love to see more ways of flying. You know, in previous games, we've had sailing, for example, in Wind Waker. We've also seen flying in Skyward Sword on the back of a Loftwing. So we've seen a lot of comparisons between Skyward Sword and Breath of the Wild 2. You know, I'd love to see more flying vehicles and different ways to fly using machines or something else that we've even yet to see. And in the original Breath of the Wild, one of the Divine Beasts, well, that was a flying machine, so we know the technology exists in Hyrule. Well, next up we got the return of unique boss battles. So the original Breath of the Wild suffered a little bit from stale bosses. So all of the Divine Beasts had a similar boss battle, and at the end of the game, Calamity Ganon changed things up a little bit with a multi-phase boss battle. Lionels, they were also pretty tough in the game and could be regarded as roaming mini-bosses. One of the best things about the old-style Legend of Zelda games like Ocarina of Time or Link to the Past or Twilight Princess was the varied boss battles. The mechanics were really interesting. They were normally specific to the dungeon where you'd find them. But for me, the bosses in Breath of the Wild felt like an afterthought. Much of the design and the development and the focus of the team went into the massive environment, which is understandable as this was the first open-world Zelda game, but I would love to see these unique boss battles coming back to The Legend of Zelda. Well, next up we got expanded villages or settlements. So villages, well, they were good in Breath of the Wild with many NPCs to talk to, plus you could actually buy your own house later on in the game with enough money and materials. I would love to see villages and maybe even settlements expanded in Breath of the Wild 2. So looking back at Red Dead Redemption 2, where you had a roaming gang and they would create their own settlement for a few chapters, roaming around the map. I'd really like to see this kind of thing happen in Hyrule. I did enjoy some of the side quests which originated in villages in the first game, although I'd like to see these side quests expanded a little further. So for example, I'd like to do more than fetch a certain number of items or find a bunch of chickens. More meaningful side quests woven into the story, similar to The Witcher 3, well, that would be absolutely perfect. Well, next up, I'd like to see hard mode from the start. So yes, we had master mode in the original Breath of the Wild after you completed the game, and that was a fantastic experience. But I would really like to see this in the game from the start, just to offer up a more challenging mode if fans want it. We've seen From Software learn from Nintendo when looking at the wildly successful Elden Ring, and I'd like to see Nintendo learn from Software. Don't be afraid of difficulty or challenge, put it in the game, and I think the reception would be absolutely incredible. Keep the regular mode there for those who want to play it, but add in master mode or hard mode from the start, and I think fans would absolutely lap it up. Well, next up, it would be the return of one of my favourite enemies ever in the Legend of Zelda series, and I would really like to see the return of Dark Link. So Dark Link is the evil reflection of Link. Dark Link appears in many Legend of Zelda games, although I probably remember him best from Ocarina of Time. He's one of the most enigmatic enemy characters in the Legend of Zelda series, usually appearing with no backstory and no dialogue, although it is implied on numerous occasions he's merely constructed of shadow magic. Dark Link is normally seen as the ultimate challenge, because it's not a monster Link is fighting, he's fighting himself. And I would love to see Dark Link return in some form in Breath of the Wild 2. Well, finally, we've got dungeons. So the original Breath of the Wild was probably the best game of all time. However, fans of the classic Zelda series missed the old school type of dungeons, like the previous Zelda games, dating all the way back to the original Legend of Zelda on the NES. Yes, we got the Divine Beasts and the Shrines, but they didn't really hold a candle to the old dungeons from Skyward Sword, Ocarina of Time, Link to the Past, and even the original Legend of Zelda. The return of dungeons would also allow the return of boss variation, something that was lacking from Breath of the Wild that I went through earlier. So the Divine Beast bosses were good, but they did feel very samey, so I would really love to see dungeons coming back. You could just imagine it, the design team from the original Breath of the Wild focusing on dungeons. It would be absolutely fantastic. I think one of my favourite dungeons of all time is the Water Temple in Ocarina of Time, and can you imagine seeing something like that in Breath of the Wild 2? Well, let me know in the comments what you want to see added to Breath of the Wild 2. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So I don't want this channel to be just one-way conversation. I would love to hear your thoughts, and you'd be surprised, I do tend to reply to most comments. Well, that is it for this look at 10 things that we want Nintendo to add to Breath of the Wild 2. And as always, thank you so much for watching or listening. For more Legend of Zelda content like this, hit that subscribe button down below and subscribe to Triforce Times. Or you can check me out on Twitter at Triforce Times. Well, if you enjoyed this video, found it useful, liking and sharing the video would really help me out. Otherwise, check out the other videos on the channel. Well, thanks again, and I'll see you soon.